Anxiety doesn't start when something goes wrong. It starts when I let my mind run wild. That's when I realized I wasn't living. I was reacting. Reacting to thoughts, fears, and scenarios that didn't even exist. And when I discovered Kiharu Nakamura's teachings, I understood that I needed to regain control of my mind before it dragged me completely into chaos. Stay with me until the end, because I'm going to show you the exact path to regaining control of your mind and your life. When I realized that anxiety was controlling me, I no longer controlled my thoughts. It was as if my mind had become a wild horse, galloping without reins, dragging me through dangerous terrain while I screamed inside, begging it to stop. But I couldn't hold the reins. Each thought pulled another and yet another in an endless stream of worries, imaginary catastrophes, and apocalyptic scenarios that my brain created with frightening creativity. What if I lose my job? What if that person was judging me? What if I said something wrong? What if everything goes wrong? It was a constant bombardment of what-ifs that transformed my mind into a battlefield where I was simultaneously the soldier and the enemy. I would wake up already on high alert, as if there were a lion in the room, but the lion was invisible and lived only inside my head. They pulled me in every direction, as if I were a hostage inside my own head. There wasn't a moment of respite, a second of peace where I could simply exist without being kidnapped by some anxious thought. Was I having breakfast? My mind was already at the 2 p.m. meeting, imagining everything that could go wrong. Was I talking to a friend? Half of my consciousness was analyzing every word I said, judging myself, predicting negative reactions. Was I trying to sleep? It was the worst moment of all, because in the silence of the night, the thoughts screamed even louder, showing me a horror movie about my future starring all my insecurities. I had become a prisoner within myself, and the cell had no keys because the walls were made of my own uncontrolled thoughts. The scariest thing was realizing I had lost the ability to distinguish between useful thoughts and parasitic thoughts. Everything seemed urgent. Everything seemed important. Everything seemed like a real threat that needed my immediate attention. My brain could no longer filter or prioritize. A worry about a work presentation had the same emotional weight as a worry about a possible fatal illness based on a symptom I had read about online. A minor argument with my partner mentally transformed into a harbinger of imminent separation. An unanswered email meant total rejection. I was living in a distorted reality where everything was amplified, dramatized, and catastrophized to the extreme, and I could no longer see things as they really were. There were times when I tried to fight the thoughts, tried to force them to stop, tried to think positive, as everyone advised me. But it was like trying to hold water with open hands. The tighter I squeezed, the more slipped through my fingers. The more I fought the anxiety, the more power I gave it. The more I tried not to think about something, the more it dominated my mind. It was exhausting. It was like being in a war where each battle I won only summoned 10 new enemies. I was tired of fighting, tired of trying to control the uncontrollable, tired of living in a perpetual state of tension where relaxing, for a second, seemed dangerous, as if the world would crumble the instant I let my guard down. Anxiety takes over when I stop choosing where to place my attention. That was the brutal truth I had to face. I had handed over the remote control of my mind to anxiety and was just passively watching as it switched channels between different horror programs. Each anxious thought was like a channel I involuntarily tuned into, and once tuned in, I was stuck watching the entire horror show without being able to turn it off or change it. My attention, which should be my most valuable tool, my most precious ability, had become a sail in the wind, blown in 1,000 different directions without any intention or purpose of my own. I was no longer directing my own consciousness. I was being directed by it. And at that specific moment, sitting on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m. with my heart racing and my hands trembling after yet another panic attack that came out of nowhere, I realized, with crystal clear, painful clarity, I no longer had any choices. I didn't choose what to think about. I didn't choose how to feel. I didn't choose how to react. I was like a rudderless boat being tossed from side to side by the waves of anxiety, and the most terrifying thing was that I didn't even remember how to hold the rudder anymore. I had forgotten that choosing was possible. I had forgotten that my mind was mine, not anxiety's. I had forgotten that at some point in the past, I had been able to intentionally direct my attention instead of being a slave to every thought that arose. At that moment on the cold bathroom floor, I hit rock bottom. And it was from rock bottom that I finally began to look up, searching for a way out that I didn't even know existed. The hidden root of my agitation. I thought my anxiety was caused by the world. After all, it was so obvious, so clear, so logical to blame external circumstances for the internal chaos I was experiencing. How could I not be? Anxious with a boss who sent emails at 11 p.m. expecting immediate responses? How could I not be agitated by piling up bills, impossible deadlines, infernal traffic, and frightening news bombarding my screen every minute? The world was objectively stressful, objectively chaotic, objectively anxious. I looked around and saw everyone rushing, everyone busy, everyone stressed, and I convinced myself that my anxiety was just a natural, even appropriate response to a hostile environment. It was comforting to think that way because it meant the problem wasn't me. It was the world. And if the world was the problem, then I was the victim. And victims don't need to take responsibility. Because of work. I constantly repeated this narrative. This job is killing me. It's the pressure, the unrealistic expectations, the lack of recognition. And yes, my job had its challenges, its injustices, its genuinely difficult moments. But I started to notice something disturbing. There were people in the same environment, facing the same pressures, dealing with the same difficult bosses, and they weren't crumbling like I was. They didn't have panic attacks in the bathroom. They didn't spend the night awake, mentally rehearsing every word spoken in a meeting. They didn't tremble before opening their work email. And when I realized this, instead of questioning my narrative, I simply assumed they were stronger, more capable, more prepared. It never occurred to me that perhaps they just had a different relationship with the same events I was experiencing. Because of people. Oh, how many times I blamed the people around me for my inner turmoil. So-and-so is so dramatic. It makes me anxious. So-and-so won't stop complaining. It exhausts me. That person didn't even answer me. Obviously, they don't like me, and it's consuming me. I had constructed an elaborate narrative where each person in my life was responsible for some part of my anxiety. My mother, with her constant worries. My partner who didn't understand my emotional state. My friend who seemed to have the perfect life and made me feel inadequate. My colleagues who judged me. Strangers on the street who looked at me strangely. I had transformed everyone around me into villains in the story of my anxiety, without realizing that I was writing the story in a way that guaranteed my role as a perpetual victim. Because of the problems. The list was endless and constantly renewed itself. Financial problems, health problems, real or imagined, relationship problems, problems with the house, the car, the family, the uncertain future, the past I can't change. Each problem was like a soldier in the army of anxiety, and I sincerely believed that if only I could solve all these problems, if I could eliminate all external sources of stress, then I would finally find peace. So I spent years trying to do that, trying to earn more money to solve the financial problems, trying to obsessively control my health to eliminate that source of anxiety, trying to be perfect in relationships to avoid conflict. It was like trying to plug holes in a leaky boat. For every hole I plugged, 2 new ones appeared. The problems never ended because I was looking in the wrong place. But the truth was harsher, more brutal, harder to swallow than any external explanation could be. The anxiety came from the stories I told myself. It wasn't the events that made me anxious. It was the narrative I constructed about those events. It wasn't the boss's email that created the anxiety. It was the story I told myself about what that email meant about me, about my worth, about my future. It wasn't the person who didn't reply to my message that generated the agitation. It was the elaborate story I created about rejection, abandonment, inadequacy. It wasn't the problem itself that consumed me. It was the future catastrophe I imagined resulting from that problem. I was the narrator, screenwriter, director, and lead actress of a horror movie playing 24 hours a day on the screen of my mind, and I had completely forgotten that I myself was writing the script. This realization was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant I had more power than I thought. If I was creating the stories, I could create different ones. But terrifying because it meant I could no longer blame anything or anyone. It meant that all those times I said, "You made me anxious," or "This situation is causing me stress," I was lying to myself. It wasn't them. It wasn't the situation. It was me, choosing, even unconsciously, to interpret, amplify, catastrophize, and dramatize. It was me taking a neutral event and painting it with apocalyptic colors. It was me transforming a stone in the road into an insurmountable mountain. And the hardest thing to accept, I had been doing this for so long that I had forgotten I was doing it. The anxious stories had become so automatic, so habitual, so much a part of me, that I confused them with reality. But stories are not reality. Stories are stories, and I urgently needed to learn the difference between the two. The wisdom of Kiharu Nakamura. Presence is your only defense. While studying the life of Kiharu Nakamura, a legendary geisha of the Meiji period, known for her unwavering serenity even amidst the chaos of Japan's modernization, I realized something that completely changed my understanding of anxiety. Kiharu lived in a time of violent transformation, where Japan was being forced to open up to the West, where millennia-old traditions were being discarded overnight, where uncertainty about the future was as real and palpable as the air we breathe. She had every reason in the world to live anxiously, worried, agitated. But the historical records about her speak of a woman who carried a profound, almost supernatural peace, a calmness that did not depend on external circumstances being under her control. And I became obsessed with understanding how. How did she achieve this when I, living in a time with much more comfort and security, lived in a constant state of alarm? She didn't overcome anxiety by fighting against it. That was the first great lesson I learned from Kiharu's life. In her writings about her practices and teachings, there is never any mention of techniques to combat anxious thoughts, to defeat worry, to conquer fear. All the warlike language I used, and that our modern culture constantly uses, simply didn't exist in her vocabulary. She didn't see anxiety as an enemy to be destroyed. She saw it as a passing cloud, a temporary visitor, a wave in the ocean of consciousness. And just as you don't fight against a cloud or a wave, she didn't fight against anxiety. Because she understood something fundamental that I had forgotten. What you resist persists. What you attack grows stronger. Fighting anxiety is just more anxiety disguised as a solution. She triumphed by returning to the present moment. That was her secret weapon, her daily practice, her unwavering defense against mental chaos. Whenever she felt her mind begin to wander into dangerous territories of the uncertain future or the painful past, Kiharu had a simple ritual. She returned to her five senses. What was she seeing at that exact moment? What was she hearing? Feeling on her skin? Smelling in the air? Tasting? She anchored her awareness in the only time that truly exists, now. And in the now, there is rarely real danger. In the now, we are usually well. In the now, there is only this moment, this breath, this sensation. Anxiety lives in the imagined future or the reinterpreted past. It never lives in the pure present. And Kiharu knew this with every fiber of her being. Presence is an invisible but impenetrable shield. I started testing this in my own life, and the results were immediate and surprising. When I felt anxiety starting to engulf me, instead of fighting it or letting it drag me down, I simply returned to the present. I sat and focused on the physical sensations, the weight of my body in the chair, the texture of my clothes on my skin, the temperature of the air, the sounds around me. And something magical happened. Not that the anxiety disappeared instantly, as if by magic, but it lost its intensity, its power to completely hijack me. It was as if, by returning to the present, I created a space between myself and the anxiety. I could still observe it, recognize it, but it was no longer me. I was the sky, and the anxiety was just a passing cloud. The sky doesn't become the cloud, and I didn't need to become the anxiety. When I returned to the present moment, anxiety loses the weapon it uses against me, the imagined future. This realization was revolutionary. All my anxiety, all of it without exception, was about things that hadn't happened yet. What if I lose my job? Future. What if that person rejects me? Future. What if I get sick? Future. What if everything goes wrong? Future. Even when my anxiety seemed to be about the past, It was actually about the future consequences of what had already happened. Anxiety is essentially a mental time machine that drags me into a future that doesn't exist, making me suffer over events that never happened and perhaps never will. And Kiharu taught me that I don't need to board that time machine. I can simply choose to stay here, now, where life truly happens. I began to understand why Kiharu called presence defense and not attack. It's not that you use presence to attack and destroy anxiety. You use presence as a shield that anxiety simply cannot penetrate. It's like being in a safe fortress while a storm rages outside. The storm may be noisy, it may be frightening, it may seem powerful, but it cannot touch you if you remain within the fortress of the present moment. And the most beautiful thing is that this fortress is not something you need to build. It's already here. It always has been. It always will be. The present moment is eternally accessible, eternally safe, eternally real. You just need to learn to return to it, repeatedly, patiently, gently, as Kiharu did every day of his life. Not fighting the storm, but simply choosing to remain in the only place where the storm cannot reach. Here and now. My body spoke, before my consciousness heard it. I ignored the signs as if they were annoying inconveniences disrupting my routine. Little fire alarms I turned off without investigating whether there was actually a fire. My breathing was short, shallow, always trapped in the upper part of my chest, as if an invisible weight were preventing my lungs from expanding fully. I breathed as if I were constantly running from something, even when I was sitting motionless in front of the computer. But I didn't pay attention. I thought it was normal, that everyone breathed like that it didn't matter. After all, I was alive. I was breathing. So what was the problem? I didn't yet understand that the way you breathe is the way you live, and I was living in the breath of constant fear, in the breath of perpetual escape, in the breath of someone who is never truly safe. The tightness in my chest was such a constant companion that I had completely normalized this feeling of permanent constriction. It was as if there was an elastic band wrapped around my chest, squeezing, never allowing full expansion, never allowing a deep sigh of relief. Some nights the pressure would become so intense that I would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like I was being crushed, as if someone were sitting on my chest. But even then, I rationalized. It must be bad posture. It must be reflux. It must be anything but what it really was. Because acknowledging what it really was would mean admitting that something was deeply wrong with the way I was living, and I wasn't ready for that admission. So I continued ignoring it, continued living with it, continued pretending that it was normal to live with a perpetually constricted chest. My restless hands told a story my mouth refused to speak. They never stayed still, never rested, never fully relaxed. They were always fidgeting, picking at my skin, biting my nails until they bled, drumming my fingers nervously on the table, twisting and untwisting a piece of paper, clenching and releasing my hand in a repetitive fist. When I was in meetings, my hands were hidden under the table because I was ashamed of their constant agitation. But hiding them didn't calm them. They continued their restless trembling, their nervous dance, their physical manifestation of all the anxiety I tried to suppress mentally. My hands knew the truth I denied. I wasn't okay. I wasn't calm. I wasn't in control of absolutely anything. There were so many other signs that I refused to acknowledge, like the clear message they were. The constant tension in my shoulders, always hunched over, almost touching my ears, as if I were constantly protecting myself from a blow that never came. The clenched jaw that I only noticed when I woke up with a headache because I'd spent the whole night grinding my teeth. The upset stomach that made the idea of eating nauseating most mornings. My hands and feet always cold, even on hot days, because all my blood was concentrated in my vital organs, my body permanently in survival mode. My heart racing for no apparent reason, palpitations that came out of nowhere and made me fear I was having a heart attack at 28. Each of these symptoms was my body screaming, "Stop! Something is wrong, you need to change something." But I remained deaf. My body always knew my mind was racing too fast, operating at an unsustainable frequency, constantly running in overdrive without ever letting up. While my consciousness tried to rationalize, minimize, justify, and ignore, my body kept an honest record of everything. It couldn't lie. It couldn't pretend. It was the faithful accountant of my true inner condition, physically manifesting what I refused to acknowledge mentally. Every muscle tension was an unspoken truth. Every shallow breath was an unprocessed fear. Every heart palpitation was a warning I silenced. My body was an open book, written in a language I had forgotten how to read, and it had been trying to tell me the same urgent story for years. You are living in a way that is unsustainable. You are in emergency mode when there is no real emergency. You need to stop. But I only listened when I was already crumbling inside, when the signs I had ignored for so long finally accumulated into a crisis that could no longer be ignored. That's when my body simply refused to cooperate with my denial. When the anxiety manifested so intensely that I could no longer function. When the panic attacks became so frequent that I was afraid to leave the house. When the physical exhaustion was so profound that I could barely get out of bed. It took my body completely rebelling against the tyranny of my racing mind for me to finally pay attention. And even then, the first thing I did was look for an external solution, medication, diagnoses, treatments, without recognizing that the real solution began with learning the language my body had been speaking for so long. It wasn't my enemy betraying me with inconvenient symptoms. It was my most loyal ally trying to save me from myself, trying to awaken me to a truth my mind insisted on avoiding. I needed to slow down, return to the present, and finally begin to listen. My mind was creating fears that didn't exist. Anxiety made me believe that everything would always go wrong, inevitably, catastrophically wrong. No matter how well things were going in the present moment, my mind had an extraordinary ability to find the loose thread that could unravel the entire tapestry of my life. Was I going to a work presentation? My mind was already showing me the complete disaster movie. Me tripping on stage, forgetting all. The words, being ridiculed by colleagues, being fired afterward, losing my house, ending up in misery. Was I going to meet a friend for casual coffee? My anxiety transformed it into a scenario where I would say something terribly inappropriate, mortally offend the person, lose the friendship, and be socially rejected by everyone I knew. Every common, everyday, normal situation was transformed by my mind into a precipice where a single misstep would mean my total and irreversible destruction. Even when nothing had happened yet. Even when the feared event was just a distant possibility in the future. Even when statistically the chances of everything going right were immensely greater than the chances of it going wrong, my mind chose to focus exclusively on the worst possible scenario. It wasn't even the realistic scenario of something might not go perfectly. It was always the extreme apocalyptic scenario. My imagination, which could be used to create beautiful things, to visualize inspiring futures, to solve problems creatively, had become a machine specialized in catastrophes. It would take a tiny spark of negative possibility and fan it into a forest fire of epic proportions. And I believed in these imaginary catastrophes as if they had already happened, as if they were accomplished facts instead of fictions created by my own hyperactive and unregulated mind. I realized something deeply disturbing about my relationship with suffering. I suffered twice for every difficult event in my life. The first time was in my imagination, where I obsessively rehearsed every horrible scenario that could happen, intensely experiencing every painful emotion associated with these invented futures. I felt grief before the loss, felt rejection before the refusal, felt failure before trying, felt pain before the injury. My mind made me go through the entire path of suffering in advance, like a kind of perverse training for pain. And then, if and when the event actually happened, I suffered a second time. This time with the concrete reality of what was happening. But here's the most tragic part. Most of the time, the event didn't even happen. I suffered intensely in my imagination for things that never materialized, wasting precious emotional energy on catastrophes that existed only in my head. And the first time was always worse than reality could be. That was the discovery that began to change my relationship with anxiety. I started keeping a journal where I wrote down all the catastrophes my mind predicted, and then I would go back weeks later to check what had actually happened. The results were surprisingly consistent. In 95% of cases, the terrible thing I was absolutely sure would happen simply didn't. And in the 5% where something difficult actually did occur, it was never as devastating as my imagination had painted it. I discovered I had inner resources I didn't know I possessed. I discovered I could cope with adversity in ways I never imagined. I discovered that even when bad things happened, life went on, I went on, and I usually found solutions, or at least ways to live with the new reality. But my anxious mind had invested in keeping me scared, because fear was its way of trying to protect me. The more I feared the future, the more my mind thought it was doing its job of preparing me for danger. It was a broken alarm system, blaring deafening sirens for fires that didn't exist, screaming danger at harmless shadows on the wall. And because this system had been activated for so long, it had become hypersensitive, interpreting any uncertainty as a mortal threat, any change as impending catastrophe, any unknown as absolute danger. My mind was trying to save me, but in reality, it was imprisoning me in a distorted reality where I lived in perpetual terror of ghosts created by my own imagination. I realized I was suffering twice, once in my imagination and once in reality, and that the first time was always worse. Because it had no limits, no end, no resolution. In reality, even the most difficult situations eventually unfold in some way. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end. There are actions that can be taken. There is some kind of conclusion. But in the imagination, suffering is infinite because you can revisit the catastrophic scenario as many times as you want, adding new horrific details with each revisit, amplifying the pain, multiplying the consequences. In the imagination, you can die 1,000 deaths. In reality, each difficult situation only needs to be lived once. And that's when I finally understood this. When I realized I was voluntarily torturing myself with imaginary futures while neglecting the only moment that truly mattered, the only moment where I had real power to act, the only moment that was true now. Everything else was fiction. Frightening, compelling, visceral fiction, but fiction nonetheless. And I desperately needed to stop living in a horror novel written by my own mind and return to the only real story that exists. Life happening in this very moment. The choice that saved me. I started doing something simple yet powerful. Something that seemed almost ridiculously too basic to make a difference in the face of the storm of anxiety I had lived through for years. It wasn't a complicated technique I learned in years of therapy. It wasn't a miracle drug. It wasn't a mystical revelation that emerged at a spiritual retreat. It was simply this: returning to myself. Returning from the imaginary future where I lived most of the time. Returning from the past that I obsessively ruminated on. Returning from the 1,000 worries, the catastrophic stories, the unfounded fears. Returning to here. Returning to now. Returning to this body, this breath, this moment. It seemed so simple that initially I resisted, thinking that something so easy couldn't possibly solve something as complex as my chronic anxiety. But desperate, I decided to try anyway. And that seemingly small choice became the turning point of my entire life. Breathing became my anchor, my safe haven, my lifeline when I felt I was drowning in the ocean of anxiety. Every time I noticed my mind starting to spiral into dangerous territory, every time I felt my chest tighten and my thoughts race, I stopped everything I was doing and focused only on breathing. Not just anyway, but consciously, intentionally, deeply. I inhaled counting to 4, held for 4, exhaled for 6. And I repeated, and repeated, and repeated until something started to change in my body's chemistry, until my nervous system began to understand that there was no real danger, that it was safe to slow down. In the beginning, dozens of breaths were needed to feel any difference. But over time, with practice, just a few conscious breaths were enough to start bringing me back from the precipice of anxiety. Pausing has become my secret superpower in a world that values speed, instant reaction, and frantic productivity. I've learned that I don't need to respond immediately to every anxious thought that arises, every difficult emotion that appears, every impulse to panic. I can pause. I can create a space between stimulus and response. I can say to myself, this thought is here. I recognize it, but I don't need to believe it or act on it immediately. This pause, the sacred space of a few seconds between feeling and reacting, has been revolutionary. Before, I was like an automatic reflex. Anxiety appeared. I panicked instantly. Now, there was a choice. Anxiety appears, I pause, breathe, observe, and then consciously choose how to respond instead of reacting blindly. Viktor Frankl was right. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom and our power. Presence became my daily practice, my commitment to myself, my way of honoring the only moment that truly exists. I started small because starting big would be overwhelming and I would probably give up. Just 5 minutes in the morning, sitting in silence, focusing on the sounds around me, the sensations in my body, the light coming through the window. Just that. Without trying to meditate perfectly, without trying to empty my mind, without grandiose expectations. Just practicing being here, totally, completely, without simultaneously being in the past or the future. And those 5 minutes began to create a domino effect on the rest of my day. I started noticing when I was eating, without paying attention to the food, just mechanically swallowing while scrolling through my phone. I started noticing when I was in a conversation, but not really present, half my attention already on the next appointment. I began to recognize the 1,000 moments a day when I was physically in one place, but mentally in a completely different one. Anxiety doesn't disappear through force, struggle, resistance, or denial. All those times I tried to fight it directly only strengthened it. All the times I tried to suppress it only made it return with greater intensity. All the times I tried to rationally convince my anxious mind that there was no reason to worry were futile exercises. Because anxiety is not rational and doesn't respond to logical arguments. But something unexpected happened when I simply stopped fighting. When I acknowledged, okay, anxiety, you're here, I see you, I feel you, but you are not me. You don't define my reality, and I don't need to obey you. It began to dissolve like mist under the morning sun. Not instantly, not magically, but gradually, consistently. It dissolves when I reclaim the space between what I feel and what I do. That space is everything. It's where my humanity, my dignity, my capacity for choice reside. It's the difference between being an animal reacting instinctively to every stimulus and being a conscious human being capable of intentional response. Before, there was no space at all. I felt anxiety and immediately became anxiety, identified completely with it, acted from it. Now, there is a precious space. I feel anxiety and observe, there is anxiety present. And in that simple act of observation, I have already created separation. I have already remembered that I am the observer, not the observed. I am the sky, not the cloud. I am the consciousness that witnesses anxiety, not anxiety itself. And from this position of observer, I can make different choices. I can feel anxiety and still act with courage. I can recognize fear and still take the next step. I can honor my emotions without being enslaved by them. That space between feeling and doing, that millimeter of freedom that I recovered through breathing, pausing, and being present, was literally what saved me from a lifetime imprisoned in the prison of my own anxious mind. Regaining control. My way back, I began to act like Kiharu, not because I was superficially imitating her gestures or mechanically copying her techniques, but because I finally understood the profound philosophy that guided her every action. With unwavering calm, not the passive calm of someone who has given up or resigned themselves, but the active calm of someone who consciously chose not to be swept away by external or internal chaos. It was the calm of a rock in the middle of a turbulent river. The water flows, the storm rages, but the rock remains. I began to cultivate this quality in every challenging situation. When someone provoked me, when I received bad news, when I felt anxiety trying to kidnap me again. Instead of reacting impulsively as before, I stopped, breathed, and chose calm as my initial response. And something extraordinary happened. The people around me began to calm down too. My calm created a field of serenity that influenced the entire environment, exactly as Kiharu did centuries ago. Mental elegance became my new way of thinking, very different from the chaotic and noisy mess my mind used to be, just as Kiharu chose each. Movement with intentional grace, each word with poetic precision, each gesture with profound meaning. I began to treat my thoughts with the same curatorial care. Not every thought that arises deserves my attention. Not every worry that knocks on the door deserves to be invited in and sit at the table. Not every anxious story my mind tells deserves to be believed as absolute truth. I developed the ability to observe my thoughts as if I were watching clouds passing in the sky. Interesting. Remarkable. but not necessarily something I need to identify with or act upon. This mental elegance meant having fewer thoughts, but of superior quality. It meant consciously choosing where to place my precious attention instead of letting it be stolen by any distraction or worry that appeared. Silent courage emerged as the most surprising quality I developed in this process. Not the noisy courage that shouts and makes a fuss, not the performative courage that needs an audience and recognition, but the quiet courage to keep going even when it's difficult, to choose presence even when escape is easier, to return to the present moment for the 1,000th time, even after getting lost in worries for the 1,000th time. Kiharu demonstrated this courage every day by simply continuing to be herself in a world that was violently changing around her. She didn't need to proclaim her strength. She lived it silently. And I started to do the same. Courage to admit when I'm anxious instead of pretending to be strong. Courage to ask for help when I need it instead of pretending I can handle it alone. Courage to be vulnerable, imperfect, in process, instead of maintaining a facade of having everything under control. Taking back control isn't about eliminating anxiety completely. It's not about reaching a mythical state where I never feel fear or worry again. That was one of the biggest revelations of my process. The goal wasn't to eradicate anxiety from my existence, because that would be impossible and even undesirable. Anxiety, in appropriate doses, keeps us safe, alerts us to real dangers, and motivates us to prepare adequately. The problem was never feeling anxiety occasionally. The problem was that anxiety had taken total control of my life, becoming the dominant voice, the driving force, the tyranny under which I lived. Taking back control means that now I am the captain of the ship again. Anxiety may still appear as a passenger. It may even shout suggestions from the deck, but it is no longer holding the helm and deciding the direction. It's about learning to walk above it with posture, focus, and serenity. Kiharu walked the streets of Kyoto with a posture that communicated unwavering dignity, not because she didn't have problems or worries, but because she didn't allow those worries to determine how she inhabited her body and moved through the world. I learned to do the same. Anxiety may be present. I can feel its vibrations in my nervous system. But that doesn't mean I need to slump my shoulders, quicken my pace, lose my breath, or abandon my presence. I can acknowledge there is anxiety here and simultaneously choose to move through it with grace, with intention, with the dignity of someone not defined by their temporary emotional states. Like walking on a rainy day, you can acknowledge that it's raining without becoming the rain. And this path of return, this process of recovering my center, my inner sovereignty, my essential peace, begins within me now. Not in the future, when everything is resolved. Not when I've done more therapy, read more books, practiced more meditation. Now, at this very moment, in this breath, in this choice to be present instead of lost in the labyrinth of anxious thoughts. Kiharu taught me that the present moment is the only point of real power that exists. The past has already happened and cannot be changed. The future does not yet exist and cannot be controlled. But this moment, this eternal now, this is the field where I can plant seeds of calm, water them with conscious breathing, cultivate them with patient presence. And if I do this consistently, moment after moment, day after day, I will eventually reap a completely different life. Not a life without anxiety, but a life where anxiety no longer rules, where I am the master and not the slave, where I walk with the elegance, calm, and courage that Kiharu Nakamura demonstrated was possible more than a century ago. If this journey touched something within you, if you recognized your own story in the words I shared, then you need to stay with me. This video is just the beginning of a much deeper transformation that I want to share with you. Subscribe to this channel now, because in the next videos, I'm going to teach you the specific techniques I use to go from being a hostage to anxiety to mastering my own mind. I'll show you practical exercises inspired by ancient geishas that you can do in 5 minutes to regain your calm in any situation. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos in this series about the path to serenity. Because understanding the problem is only the first step. Now let's move together towards practical solutions, concrete tools, and real transformation. And leave a comment telling me which of these topics resonated with you the most. What was the moment when you thought, "This is me"? I read all the comments, and your story can inspire other people who are on the same journey. anxiety may have been controlling you until now, but that changes today. Let's walk together along the path Kiharu showed us, back to presence, to peace, and to the true power that has always been within us. See you in the next video. And remember, the path back begins with a single choice, and you just made that choice by reaching the end of this video. Stay with me. The transformation is only beginning.